Now please don't click away. Yes, of course, the Entente did win World War I. But across the war, the concept of the Entente had changed. Initially, it was a simple alliance between France and Russia, later informally joined by Britain and their empire. But as the war began, it would grow into a loose alliance of various anti-Central Power nations. It would be this massive coalition that won World War I in our timeline. This timeline instead explores a world where a smaller Entente won the conflict, which, most importantly, had the effect of removing America from the conflict while Tsar Nicholas joined Britain and France at the peace table. Now, in terms of how we make this happen, I explored this in depth in last week's video. What if everything went perfect for the Entente? Don't worry though, as that one focuses mostly on the military aspect, while this one focuses on the post-war consequences. Still, should you want to watch the other video first, this is your chance to leave. Alright, you ready? Then let's discuss the world as it was created by the four great powers relevant to our story: Britain, France, Russia, and Italy. These four powers were the principal forces behind the redrawing of Europe's map. Now here, we immediately recognize a major difference. Rather than the balanced attitudes towards peace in our timeline, Russia and France are both squarely in favor of harsh consequences for the Central Powers. Very different from America's Wilson, who favored things like self-determination. The full extent of the peace deal I explored in the past video, but let's quickly run through the results. Germany faces a harsher deal, not just losing Alsace, but the Saarland too, and most importantly, France and Russia push hard for French puppets on the western Rhineland. In the north then, Denmark is greatly expanded to take the Kiel Canal from Germany. Finally, Russia would announce a new, mildly autonomous Poland, which seizes some German territories in the east. Austria-Hungary would get a lighter peace deal in this timeline, with both successor states being moderately larger, with the former Entente still weighing their future allies in the region. Bulgaria, who actually joined the Entente in this timeline, has come out of the war as a giant, but also as a pariah in the region, while Italy stands proud along the Adriatic. Finally, the Ottomans were successfully partitioned by the Entente due to less war weariness and Russian assistance. This is roughly the map of Europe. Let's now start by highlighting the biggest change of this alternate history. The war was almost 2 years shorter. This is crucial in many ways. Most importantly, with less people dying and the economic situation across the world being better. In our timeline, Britain had gone in extreme debt to afford the cost of the war, spending about 4 times their income in the later years of the war, and by the end of the conflict had a debt to GDP ratio of 180%. In this alternate timeline, most of the expenses in 1918 didn't happen, while the 1917 budget would be far smaller too. These factors already reduced Britain's overall debt by the end of the conflict, especially when considering another important factor. Russia's debt across this war had risen fast, from about 50% of GDP at the start of the war to more than 175 by 1917. This while the nation was suffering from the consequences of the war and millions had perished. Like mentioned, Britain had a similar ratio after our timeline's World War I, and despite their far more advanced economy, they still struggled so much with repayment that over 45% of the government budget went to their debts. Russia would have to struggle even more than our timeline's Britain would have. At the same time, these debts would go to France and Britain, which together with German war reparations and the plundering of Turkey further eased the Western debt burden when compared to our timeline. Adding to this, Russia has many more issues. Before the war, most of their economic growth came from investment, mainly from their great ally of France. But now, the once unbreakable Franco-Russian alliance weakens. For France, the purpose had been simple: use Russia's immense power against the Germans. To this end, major French investments into the Russian military, but also industries and resources were made. This leaves Russia with a very big issue after the war. France is now in debt, and major parts of the nation have been damaged. French and British investments into Russia will likely be greatly diminished, further hurting their economy. By this time, around 80% of Russia's industry was foreign owned, and they lacked their own capitalist base to invest in industry themselves. Before the war, Russia was a rising economic force. Now, they would likely start to stagnate, if not worse. Next, let's discuss Germany. After the war, whether by force or by revolution, the Kaiser is likely deposed. With the total disaster that the war represents, and the humiliating position post-war, I don't think there is any saving in his position. A new democratic regime would be set up, but its future is uncertain. Revanchism would be obviously ripe in this new Germany, and the reclamation of the Rhineland will be a priority for any regime. Interestingly, the role of France and Germany from before the war has now completely shifted. At the end of the Franco-Prussian War, it was France who was alone in Europe, with Germany attempting to keep them isolated. Now, it would be Germany who is isolated, with France attempting to keep the Entente united against them. The attitudes of Russia and Britain against Germany will greatly determine the future of that state. One good thing though, with a shorter war and parts of the Rhineland split, war reparations on the new state will likely be lessened. The final great power immediately impacted is the US. American loans, both private and government, had flooded to Europe. This was obviously amazing for the US, which got to collect interest from Europe post-war, greatly feeding into their economic boom during the 1920s. Now, even without this, America would still be doing fine post-war, but the roaring 20s would just be slightly less affluent for America. But more importantly, US financial institutions are far more separate from those in Europe, at least in the short term. All in all, we might have a shot at a rather peaceful world. The lessening of French and British debt leaves them far more capable to respond to potential troublemakers, mainly Germany. Italy, which fell to ultranationalism in our timeline, is far less likely to do so now, due to a shorter war, therefore a better economy, and some very solid gains for their showing in the war. Russia remains a potential troublemaker on paper, but as we will soon explore, we don't need to fear them starting a major conflict in the near future either. Especially with Britain starting to fear the rise of Russia like they had done in the past. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. But let's move back a bit to the US. In our timeline, the Great Depression cuts the interwar period in half, indirectly accelerating all the problems leading to World War II. But the reason that an American stock market crash was felt this intensely was because of World War I. Of course, you had some trade disruptions with one of the largest economies on Earth. But in Europe, you also have various nations paying off massive loans to America, which they are now unable to do, while the cost of lending is also going up significantly. Germany felt it the other way around. They were paying war reparations to France and Britain, and American loans massively helped in this regard. Exactly because American loans dried up, war reparations became tougher to repay, meaning France and Britain struggled even more with repaying their own debts. And congrats, we now have a global economic crisis. So, would there be an economic crash around this time in this alternate timeline? It is very possible. America was still ripe for a boom and bust period, as exports, especially to Europe, would have increased significantly. Should such an event occur though, it is very possible that it remains far more contained to the US and be less relevant in especially Europe. One exception though is Japan, who was hopelessly reliant on American trade and would likely still enter economic decline and military rule like in our timeline. But as we pause the Asian theater, in Europe I expect the weakest link to be Russia. Obviously, their economic issues were already terrible, putting them in a difficult position to recover from the devastation of war. Now of course, winning the war would have been a great boost to the popularity of the Tsar, but really, what valuable territories did they gain? They gained some territories in Poland, which were amongst the poorest in all of Austria-Hungary, as well as a bit of eastern Anatolia. The only really important territory gained was Constantinople, which provides potential for Russia's navy into the future, but doesn't magically fix the nation's economic issues. There is still the aftermath of Rasputin in the capital, and Nicholas's war mistakes are not forgotten. Yes, massive post-war propaganda and an easing of the situation save his position for now. But what about 10 years after the war? If the economic situation continues to worsen and the price of food struggles to recover, anger aimed at Tsar Nicholas's autocratic rule would remain. So long term, I have little hope for the Tsar to remain in office, except, at best, as a constitutional monarch, though I doubt it. The main issue with being an absolute ruler is that everyone will blame you for everything. At some point during the late 20s or early 30s, the Tsar gets deposed, as an uneasy republic would get set up. But unlike our timeline, where that republic got built during World War I, a war that the new government would continue with little success, building the bedrock for the communist revolution that would engulf the nation later that year, this alternate Russian revolution would be different. We will discover two potentials for Russia here. In the first, the Republicans succeed in reforming the nation. In the second, they don't, and more significant issues start rocking the Russian state. The main separator between the two timelines is the economy. This new republic is likely quite popular with American and British leadership, who would welcome the fall of an autocratic regime. Russian loan repayments might be lowered or paused for a while, giving time for some radical restructuring of the state and the economy. This might also be coupled with a new surge of investments as optimism engulfs Europe with the fall of the last major autocracy. Now, one issue that the new government will face are their minorities. Finland would declare independence, as they were in a personal union with Russia through Tsar Nicholas. Without him, the nation would attempt to leave. Similarly, Poland will also attempt to break away from the empire, or at least become even more autonomous. Luckily, the Republicans, on the whole, were quite in favor of granting autonomy to the nationalities of the empire. The borders of this and which nationalities actually get autonomy are unclear, but it could help greatly stabilizing the Russian Republic, and it makes the regime yet more popular in international circles. If these political and economic reforms are successful, Russia would be in a solid spot. Russia's economy could start growing again, and its massive population can truly be unleashed. In 1914, Russia had about 15 million fewer people than the European great powers combined, only counting for their European holdings. By 1925, this had changed radically, with an about 50 million difference. Much of this is easily explained. First, Russia had simply lost a lot of territory, accounting for about 35 million people. And besides, the Russian Civil War alone killed a further 10 million and left Russia devastated. Both of these factors would not be the case here, and by an alternate 1925, Russia might have an equal, if not larger amount of people overall. Once their economic machine gets going, they have the population and resources to sustain their growth. Yet, don't expect explosive growth immediately, because rather than forced mass industrialization, Russia's economy could start growing naturally. They remain tied to international markets, unlike the far more isolated Soviets were. Growth would start slower than with the Soviets, and would initially be focused on modernizing agriculture to mass exports to the wealthy European market. Russia's industry would take longer to catch up, but would be far more healthy as time progresses. With all the pieces now in play, I don't really see a major world war occurring in this timeline. There would almost certainly be minor conflicts breaking out all over the world, especially around the Balkans, with Bulgaria likely to get humbled by their neighbors at some point. But in terms of the great powers, Italy is too weak, and potentially not ultranationalist. France has no more reason for aggression, instead focusing on solidifying their rule over the Rhine. As long as France and Russia remain strong, I highly doubt that the rise of an openly revanchist German regime would be allowed to take place, swiftly facing action. A nation like the Ottomans, or maybe Turkey, is similarly too weak, And without a collapse in the international order, it will be kept down by the former Entente. Over in Asia, we might see Japan attempt to expand their influence, but here, a powerful Russia, not really threatened over in Europe anymore, is likely to develop a strong partnership with a government in China, leaving the Japanese with a far more difficult war to win. Should such a conflict actually occur, I highly doubt that the Japanese would fare very well. Entering the 40s, predictions become far more difficult. With the advent of many new technological innovations, the world is about to radically change. And how this will impact the many nations of this alternate timeline, with leaderships and geopolitics completely butterflied away, I will leave up in the air for now. But let's go back in time and discuss the potential for a Russian civil war. Again, this is quite plausible. Russia's issues transcend just the Tsar, and removing him from power is not a guarantee of successful reform. There are quite a number of ways for the Republic to fall. First are obviously nationalist revolts, which could rock the nation. Second are the nobles, which might not appreciate the new republic. Third is the potential for communists seeking a more radical direction for the republic. Interestingly though, Lenin would already be dead by this point, meaning different leaders would need to step up. Potentially, leaders more willing to compromise with other social democratic elements. Especially in scenarios where it's the nobles rising up against the republic, we might see the communists and social democrats gain control of the state, as Russia will swiftly start disintegrating. The question now becomes, can this revolution succeed? Unlike in our timeline, where the Entente was exhausted from years of war, meaning that serious, full-scale invasion wasn't preferable, this alternate Russian collapse would come years, if not decades, after a less intense World War I, opening the door to far greater interventions in the Russian Civil War. Once more, let's discuss a number of options. Nations like Japan, France, and the UK could jump in against the communists. A broad coalition of nationalities, ideologies, and foreign interests would push back against the rising communist regime. The war still takes years, but eventually the communists are defeated. This scenario is already significantly worse for Russia. Poland and Finland are definitely lost, while Romania is expanded further. Britain almost certainly seizes the opportunity to capture Constantinople, while there is potential for independent states like the Caucasus, the Baltics, Ukraine, or further Polish expansion. Also, where in the previous scenario Russia was a democracy, that is not necessarily guaranteed here, as any of several ideologies could take charge, as by now all the West cared about was ensuring that it wasn't the communists that won. Whatever the results of this potential civil war, the Russia that rolls out of it will have a much steeper path towards reform and superpower state, especially as you can expect France and Britain will demand compensation for their intervention. This Russia is once again sent back by decades. This will undoubtedly lead to a far more chaotic world. What remains of Russia is plagued by internal strife, while the nations of Eastern Europe fight amongst each other as well. Whatever regime ends up in Moscow will try to rebuild their sphere of influence. And during this conflict, Russian oversight over Asia could have also collapsed, opening the door for rising Chinese regimes to mount a reconquest of Mongolia, as well as for Japan to consolidate influence over China. Over in Europe, the lack of Russia to police Germany could lead to a rising German regime. Should they ever manage to unite with Austria, they'd basically be handed diplomatic control over Eastern Europe, as Russia is not fit to seriously compete with them for influence, while France alone would struggle in confronting this rising Germany. This means that a lot would depend on British attitudes, which are quite possibly significantly more positive towards Germany. Interestingly enough, with Poland not having gained a corridor to the sea, this opens the door to a potential Polish-German partnership against the Soviets. As France and Britain are now alone to police Europe, I have no doubt that chaos would engulf many parts of Eastern Europe. This would have mixed sentiments in Western Europe. On the one hand, the British could be glad that the long-term threat of Russia is being contained. On the other hand, the threat of a rising Germany and Italy does not go unnoticed, while Japan too would quickly become a major troublemaker in Asia. Can peace last in such a world? I am not too sure. Finally then, there is a very real potential for a communist victory in the Civil War, most likely accomplished by lacking foreign support, a divided white movement, and either a failure of the Republican regime or a socialist takeover of it. As has become a theme here, we'd likely see Poland and Finland become independent regardless, and there is potential for a British seizure of Constantinople. In most of the reigning Russian Empire though, a Soviet Union is established, but it wouldn't be the Soviet Union of our timeline. Specifics are impossible to tell, but Lenin is almost certainly missing from the revolution, perhaps remembered as a father of the ideology, while others are forced to carry the mantle. Trotsky is likely to be a major figure early on, but once the revolution is successful, would be relegated to a background role. Stalin is also always an option, but he's far from guaranteed. So we just have to say that the Soviets are broadly communists and leave the specifics up in the air. Panic could now set in amongst the Western nations, at least partially. Their investments and loans are defaulted upon, causing a minor economic crisis in the Western world, while there are serious fears of further communist expansion. In our own timeline, the aftermath of World War I cooled this effect and left Europe initially more concerned with their own stability, after which they would be distracted by the rise of Germany as a threat, meaning the communists would take a bit of a backseat. Besides that, Stalin was also very careful about appeasing the West, making sure not to pursue an expansionist foreign policy until the Germans began to become the bigger threat. In this alternate timeline, that is all different. We have a far more powerful Britain, which is more capable of directly responding to the Soviet threat. A British-led anti-communist sphere would start to be constructed, and in the process, Britain might allow the Ottomans to rebound somewhat, lowering, but very much not removing, Entente control over Turkey. Over in Asia, the Anglo-Japanese alliance is maintained, as Britain supports their growing influence in China in exchange for an alliance against the communists. In Europe, natural allies include Romania, Poland, and Finland, each fearing Soviet invasion. But Germany too could be an attractive ally for the British. Assuming that Germany remains broadly democratic, it is very likely that Britain begins to prefer cooperation with Germany for Eastern European security rather than their alliance with France. Britain could very well start carrying the opinion that the treaty on Germany after World War I was indeed unfair, allowing German remilitarization, unification with Austria, and potentially even starting to push France to return the Rhineland to Germany, something France would almost certainly refuse. Europe would centralize between the Anglo-German alliance, Soviets, and nations like France and Italy, which play an uncertain role into the future. Now you may have noticed that I was quite vague about all of these scenarios. That is because so much has changed, it's difficult to predict with any detail. Let me know which of these scenarios you found most likely or most interesting, and how you think they might develop further. And I might make a follow-up to this video exploring one of these timelines in much more detail. For now though, I will thank you all for watching. Consider leaving a like and a comment, as well as subscribing. If you enjoyed this video, click the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, then I'm sure that the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.